Forget everything you learned in school. History isn't a master plan, it's a train wreck. We're talking about an army that destroyed itself in a single night without even seeing the enemy. A global crisis started by a pig, and a military that surrendered to a bunch of birds. This isn't fiction, it's the absolute unhinged chaos of the human race.
Welcome to the side of history that makes zero sense. Let's dive in. Imagine almost starting World War Z because of a pig. Yeah, an actual pig. Not oil, not land, not politics, a pig. Back in 1859, America and Britain were arguing over some islands near the US-Canada border, called the San Juan Islands. The border treaty was super vague. Basically, the treaty said the border goes through the channel. Which channel? There were two possible channels, and both countries looked at the same map and went, definitely ours. Meanwhile, the maps looked like they were drawn by a drunk pirate during an earthquake. Nobody actually knew where the border was, so both sides just started claiming the islands anyway. The British showed up with sheep farms. Americans started moving in too. Everybody was living in this weird, awkward tension where nobody really knew whose land it actually was.
And then one day, an American farmer named Lyman Cutler walked outside and saw a pig absolutely destroying his potato garden. Now, apparently, this pig had done this multiple times before. This wasn't just some random innocent pig. This thing was basically a repeat offender, a professional potato criminal. And Cutler finally snapped. So he grabbed his gun, aimed at the pig. Pig deleted. Unfortunately for him, the pig belonged to a British guy named Charles Griffin, who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. And this man got very angry. Cutler tried to solve the problem peacefully and offered him $10 for the pig. Honestly, pretty reasonable. But Griffin said, no, I want $100. Bro, for that price, this pig better know how to cook breakfast and pay taxes. So the argument escalated fast. British authorities threatened to arrest the American farmer, and suddenly the American settlers started panicking, and they immediately did the most American thing imaginable. They called the military. And somehow, the military actually showed up. The US sent soldiers to the island, led by Captain George Pickett. That Pickett from the Civil War later. Britain saw American soldiers arriving and responded the only reasonable way possible, apparently, by sending warships. Now suddenly two world powers were pointing giant cannons at each other because one pig got turned into bacon? At one point, there were hundreds of American soldiers, British naval ships, massive artillery cannons, and over 2,000 armed British troops involved in this situation, all over one dead pig. Imagine explaining this to future generations with a straight face. And the funniest part? Even some British commanders looked at the situation and were basically like, guys, we are not starting a war over a pig. Finally, one person with a functioning brain. So before things became unbelievably stupid, both governments stepped in and calmed everybody down. Instead of fighting, they agreed to jointly occupy the island until the border issue got solved, which means American and British soldiers spent years peacefully living together on the same island after almost going to war over potatoes. And after all the drama, all the soldiers, all the warships, and all the threats, border was finally settled in 1872, and the islands officially went to the United States. So, in the end, the only actual casualty of this entire international crisis was one extremely unlucky pig. Imagine going to war, not against a country, not against rebels, but against birds. Yeah, welcome to Australia in 1932, where the military was literally sent to fight emus. Big birds, fast birds, extremely unbothered birds. And somehow, the emus were winning. After World War I, Australian soldiers were given farmland in Western Australia. Then, the Great Depression hit. Prices collapsed, farming got harder, money disappeared. And right when things couldn't get worse, 20,000 emus showed up, migrating inland. They found farms perfect. Food everywhere, no predators, basically free real estate. The emus started destroying everything. Crops gone, fences broken, and even worse, Rabbits started sneaking through the broken fences, causing more damage. So farmers went to the government like, we need help. And the government said, we'll send the army with machine guns.
So in 1932, Major Meredith arrives with soldiers armed with Lewis machine guns and thousands of bullets. The mission was simple: eliminate emus. First encounter, they spot emus, open fire, and the emus instantly scatter in all directions like they're glitching through reality. Bullets miss a lot. Nothing works. Second attempt, they try an ambush near a dam. Over 1,000 emus appear at once. Perfect target. Until the machine gun jams after a few kills, and the rest of the emus just run away like nothing happened. Then they try chasing emus with a truck, but the terrain is rough, the ride is unstable, and the emus are faster. So now it's basically soldiers getting shaken like popcorn while failing to aim.
At some point, they realize something terrifying. The emus are actually organizing. They move in groups, split strategically, and even have leader emus watching movements. It looks like guerrilla warfare, but with birds. After days of chaos, thousands of bullets, and repeated failures, the results are embarrassing. Maybe 50 to 500 emus killed, depending on reports, but the emus still there, still farming, still destroying crops. Even the commander basically said, if we had an army like this, we'd be unstoppable. Final result? Army deployed, machine guns used, thousands of bullets fired, full military operation, and the emus still alive, still winning. Australia literally lost a war to birds.
So imagine starting a war because of pastries. Yeah, cakes, bread, snacks. Welcome to 1838 Mexico versus France, in a conflict literally called the Pastry War, because diplomacy back then was basically held together by crumbs and ego. Back then, Mexico was unstable after becoming a republic. There was chaos everywhere: political fights, looting, and general disorder. Foreigners living in Mexico often lost property during riots, and the government usually didn't compensate them. So instead of solving things locally, foreign citizens started calling their home countries for help. Now enter France. A French baker in Mexico City had his bakery in Tacubaya looted by Mexican officers. Everything was damaged. So he did what any dramatic situation in the 1800s required. He went straight to the King of France, demanding compensation. And here's where it gets ridiculous. He demanded 600,000 pesos. For context, a worker made around 1 peso per day. So France basically heard bakery damage and interpreted it as financial apocalypse level event. France then sends an ultimatum: pay up or else. Mexico refuses, so France escalates instantly. They send a full war fleet across the Atlantic. Warships, cannons, naval blockade. They start blocking Mexican ports in the Gulf of Mexico like it's a traffic jam caused by diplomacy. Then France actually attacks Veracruz, bombards a fortress, and occupies the port. At that point, Mexico declares war on France. All of this because of a bakery dispute. Trade gets blocked, so Mexico starts smuggling goods through other routes. Even Texas gets involved, trying to stop smugglers. And during one chaotic moment, barrels of flour get dumped on a beach, which later literally inspires the name Flour Bluff. Yes, a war accidentally named a place after flour. Then Mexico brings in Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the ultimate comeback character of Mexican history. He leads attacks against the French, gets injured, loses a leg, and still manages to turn it into political propaganda like it's a career upgrade. After months of pressure and fighting, France agrees to peace in 1839. Mexico agrees to pay 600,000 pesos, and France promises trade benefits. Everyone stops fighting. Here's the twist: Mexico never actually paid the money, and France later used that unpaid debt as one of the excuses for invading Mexico again years later. So in the end, this whole war was a bakery gets looted, France overreacts massively, naval war happens, nobody really wins, and somehow pastries become international politics. If you enjoyed this series, you can explore more strange true stories like this, because history is full of moments that feel impossible until you realize they actually happened. And sometimes reality is stranger than anything you could ever write. Thanks for watching.